Okay, here we're back again for another Crashout Chronicle with another great guest talking about these issues of drugs and crime, psychedelia, crime wars, paramilitaries, guerrillas, and the ways out of it all. So I'm real pleased to talk to Angela Garcia, who's a anthropologist based at Stanford, but originally from New Mexico, who I met about 12 years ago. She came down to Mexico City, and just after my first book had come out, I think we went to an Applebee's, if I remember correctly.
Yes,
To
you
hang out.
had a steak.
Yeah. That was one of my spots around the area. But anyway, great to talk to you 12 years on again.
Mhm.
Now, Angela's written two books. Among the subject areas she studies is drug addiction in Mexico, in the United States, in New Mexico, where she's from. Her first book, which she wrote way back in about 2010, I think, was The Pastoral Clinic: Addiction and Dispossession Along the Rio Grande. I'd be really interested to talk about that first because you got some really interesting insights into the wave of addiction right now, which is very, very big in New Mexico and across the United States. But your new book, which is on a fascinating subject, is The Way That Leads Among the Lost. And it's about these rehab centers in Mexico known as Anexos, which is a fascinating subject matter. And like you say in the intro, it's amazing there hasn't been more writing about this or more journalistic stories about these. I mean, it's kind of like, wow, how come we haven't done that story? That was a great story. So we'll get into that as well. Sometimes people are kind of locked up in these places in pretty terrible conditions, but it's a crazy subject. So, Angela, great to talk to you. So, first of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Where you came from, how you ended up at Stanford, and your interest in addiction on both sides of the border.
I am born and raised in New Mexico in a kind of traditional Hispano family, as we call ourselves. And one of the things that means is I grew up with addiction. It's just all around the Hispano community. It's been really endemic in that community for generations. A lot of people tracing it back to the Vietnam War, people coming back with addictions, and it just proliferating in among families who really didn't have very much going for them. And also the region that I worked in, the Espanola Valley, was also a key node for trafficking up to Denver. So there was just a lot of heroin flowing through. And for 30 years, the region where I worked and where I have family has had the highest rate of overdose in the US. And yet, so many stories focused on addiction and heroin have tended to gravitate to more urban settings. There was very little about New Mexico, even though it was, suffering greatly from heroin addiction and overdose. And so I decided to go back home and try to understand what was going on in my own community, what was going on in my own family. How did this become so endemic, so widespread, and in some ways so expected and among Hispanos themselves, it's an experience that one sort of braces them for themselves for. They know what's going to happen to at least a few people in their family, and then how do you care for the family? That was one of my main concerns, was how do people who are living with heroin addiction, often in multi-generational households, often addiction being something that is multi-generational within these households, how do they live? How do they support each other? How do they take care of each other in the throes of, detox? Where do they get drugs? How do they understand drugs? And in this region, heroin is known as medicina, or medicine in Spanish. And so I wanted to understand too, how did something that is so illicit become something that is understood as having healing properties, and that is something that is desirable for people to not only cure or at least relieve the pains that heroin use induces, but also how it kind of moves around within families in order to create relationships that are either very tight or that are very difficult and often destructive. So I really wanted to understand not only how heroin got there, but what heroin was doing to people.
You say it's like one of the worst places in the entire United States. You're talking about the state of New Mexico or the particular town?
The region, I mean, New Mexico has one of the highest rates in general, but the actual region where I worked at, which is the Espanola Valley, which considers itself the heart of New Mexico, it's where the Spanish conquistadors first went, and there's a lot of pride, complicated pride, but there's a lot of pride, and that is the region, this very poor, 98% Latino, very rural. It's about the state of Connecticut, but there's about 30,000 people, and yet it per capita has the highest rate of overdose. So everyone knows someone, at least someone, often many, many people within families. I was there recently and I had dinner with a family, and there were 4 generations of heroin users at the table. And they were openly using, they recognized it as something that was a part of their life. Did they want it in their life? No, but it was there. It was a fact of life. And it was very just overwhelming for me to see everyone from a child of the age of 14 to his great grandfather. Also someone, in their late 60s who had struggled on and off with heroin addiction, really stemming from the 1980s. So I wanted to understand this deep history of heroin use, and what I came to learn was that it was very much related to a very long history of land dispossession. These are the people that, in addition to the Native American communities, which also have their own problems with addiction, Hispanos, over the period of 200 years with American occupation, were, slowly losing their land and being, pushed off, losing their livelihood, losing their land, losing a lot of their own cultural practices. And that was replaced over time by drug use. And so I wanted to really get the relationship between sort of these broader social political context with what is actually happening on the ground, which is kind of the way I work.
This question of dispossession, and I guess you see that with a lot of drug addiction in places like Rust Belt towns where people lose their jobs and livelihood as well. One thing, so like compared to, I grew up in a middle class town in the UK, which had actually a massive heroin problem, and I knew 4 people who died of overdoses when I was a teenager. But also you see on one side, like, is it a social class thing? Because obviously in these towns, even in the poorest towns, you get wealthy people, even in the poorest towns, or relatively wealthy people, and you get doctors and teachers and police officers and on whatever professionals or business people in these places, as well as working people or people who are unemployed or whatever. So is it like that? And how, there was a documentary that, if you ever saw it, called Swansea: A Love Story. It was one of Vice's best documentaries. It was by a son of a famous film director, but it focused on these heroin addicts in Swansea, Wales, who were really just it was multi-generational as well, but really dysfunctional. I mean, these really kind of sad people. Is it like that? Because I've also known other heroin addicts who do keep up jobs, who can be like electricians and kind of keep up that job, even though they're still doing heroin on the side, and then on and off, on and off. So what's it actually like, the environment there?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely met heroin users who were working, doing construction jobs, which was really hard. So they went then offset heroin with other drugs in order to give them energy to do their work. Day laborers, there's a very large Mexican immigrant community in this region now, and they are consistently blamed for the drug problem, even though the drug problem precedes, the arrival this kind of recent wave of Mexican immigrants. So there's actually been a lot of infighting between these two communities.
Okay, so you're 10 minutes into this interview, which means you are really interested in this crazy world of drugs and crime and psychedelics and gorillas and paramilitaries and all of this stuff. So please go to www.crashoutmedia.com and you can find all kinds of stories, podcasts, analysis, reportage, news and history about this. You can subscribe for free, or if you want to support my work, then just for $5 a month, the price of a cup of cappuccino, then you get all kinds of benefits and part of the Crash Out community. Now back to the interview.
And there are some functional, users, but in general, this is a region where the majority of people live under the poverty line. They're living in multifamily households. There's more than one generation that is using, and the families are pretty messed up. But they are really committed to caring for each other, to making sure, their children, their mothers, are not needlessly suffering. And one of the ways to prevent that needless suffering is to get the drug that actually creates the suffering. And so there's this constant cycle of, I'm hurting, get me heroin. Oh, you got me heroin, I'm not hurting. Oh, but I'm hurting again because I don't have it. So there's this cycle of continuous having to find it and to buy it. And so I saw a lot of children working hard to score drugs for their family. I saw children in middle schools learning how to do drug overdose prevention with naloxone. Kids are sort of in some ways bearing the brunt of this, and they're also the ones that are most likely to find themselves falling into this world. So it was incredibly depressing, and but it was also, for me, it helped me understand the very thing that I ran away from when I was 15. I basically left home, and I wanted to get the hell out of there because I didn't want to get caught up in something that was so pervasive in my own family. But I realized many years later, you know what? It's not enough to run away. I need to run back and try to understand what's happening. And that then became the first book. And in some ways, the problem hasn't gotten any better. It's in fact worse with the arrival of fentanyl. And there's just tremendous need. And a lot of the need is the need of grandparents who are like, what can we do? Or, great grandparents, what can we do? Or raising our great grandkids, how can we, how do we do this? And, they turn to me as a kind of, because I'm one of the few people that have really written about this, they turn to me for answers, and I simply, sadly, don't have them. But what I can do is really empathize, because this is also the story of my own family. I just happened to escape it, but then felt the lure to return because I had to, basically.
Who in your family was using?
My mom, my aunt, my sister. So it was primarily the women in my family. And a lot of the book in the pastoral clinic focuses on female users and their children. So mother-daughter pairs, and the kinds of relationships that they develop, which they often talked about as being much safer than having your drug-using partner be a boyfriend or a husband. So when you're using with your kid, there tend to be in both mother and child would say, I'm safer with my mom than I would be if I were with my boyfriend or with some stranger. So it becomes almost, it perversely, a kind of harm reduction strategy to use within your own family, even though it is something that ultimately, it can disintegrate the family at the same time. So that tension was what I really was fascinated by.
Now, with fentanyl coming in now, how have you seen that change? Obviously the number of deaths must have shot up like everywhere.
Yes.
What other changes have you seen, and what do you see now with fentanyl?
It's much more visible. There's one main road, there's one main highway that connects Santa Fe to Taos. And on that part stretch of highway in the Espanola Valley, you will see people call them zombies. Young men and women, disheveled, oftentimes not fully clothed, walking. You didn't see that before. Before heroin was something that was very much something used in the house or used with, in some home, or used in the forest. So some people would go out into the forest and get high. But now it's very visible and it just looks different. And the users are younger. They're often from other parts of the state. They come there because there's more of it there. And you see homelessness now, which was nothing I ever saw. Either growing up or returning there as a graduate student, homelessness just didn't seem to exist because extended families were willing, even if they didn't want to take their relatives in. And now you just see solo people walking down the street looking completely out of it or laying on the street. And it's really quite devastating.
What's caused that change? I think that's a thing in Mexico that you don't have homeless people so much because Mexican families don't kick their people out in the street.
Right.
But what's changed in New Mexico that are now people, because the fentanyl addiction is so bad, they just can't handle these people in their house anymore? Because when I've talked to a few fentanyl users, meth users, whatever they're using. I'm actually in Tijuana. And yeah, it's different. It's a different ball game from heroin users. These are on a different level of messed up.
Yeah, there's a different level of desperation, and I've never met a user who used heroin and fentanyl who was able to keep a job, who was functional. And I knew a lot of, they're called veteranos, the veteran users who know how to shoot up carefully, who know how to, do harm reduction, who continue to use, but they continue to hold a job down. I think that is utterly impossible if someone is using fentanyl. It's just a very different drug, and it's so extraordinarily powerful. I long for the days when it was simply black tar, which itself is deadly. But nevertheless, there was a kind of knowledge, an internal knowledge of how do we use this, as safely as possible. And I don't think you can prescribe any kind of safety when fentanyl is involved.
I know it's kind of crazy that heroin is now the good old days,
Yeah.
and fentanyl is just devastating. So talking about this and your new book now, so to bring it down to Mexico City, particularly, it's about and you have a bit of a love letter to Mexico City in this new book as well. But like, what are these Anexos? What are the Anexos of Mexico City and of Mexico? What are they?
They are really complex institutions that are run by usually the informal working poor in working class neighborhoods. Primarily, I worked mostly in Mexico City, but I visited Anexos in Oaxaca, Juarez, a few other places. So I did some research in the provinces, as a lot of people like to say. And they are pretty shabby one room, spaces where you will have anywhere between 15 and 40 people who have been committed there against their will, coercively, to either detox from drugs, which is what I thought. I thought it was a drug rehab center. But what I increasingly found was that a lot of the kids that were there, and I met people from the ages of 13 to 53, they were not drug addicts. They did not identify as drug users, especially the younger people. They would just say, you know what, I use drugs like everybody else, but I'm not an addict. I'm here because there are gangs out to get me. My mom was scared and she put me here. So I began to recognize the Anexo as a kind of multi-purpose institution that not only was about drugs and addiction, but that was about questions of safety And as Mexico has become more vulnerable to violence, as certain communities have become more vulnerable to violence, whether it's criminal violence or neighborhood violence, mothers who don't want to lose their kids, who have already lost kids to the drug war, take their children and they put them in there, and they work very hard to make it possible for them to stay, because you have to pay.
Yeah,
So
how much do you pay there to keep them in?
it's about $70 a month for 1 month
Okay.
of treatment, which means basically food and lodging. And lodging means sleeping on the floor on a blanket, like a can of sardines with other people, and waking up at 6 in the morning, and eventually doing all of these things, and then going back to bed at 10 p.m. and then waking up at 6 in the morning the next day and doing it over and over and over again, sometimes for years. So I met one woman who couldn't remember how many years she was in an Anexos. She thought it was around a decade in the very same room. And so, these rooms drive people crazy, but they also keep people alive. And so that is what I was kind of trying to understand. How could a mother do this, knowing the risks of the Anexo, but weighing them against the risks of keeping their kid out, the risks of disappearance, of getting drawn into the drug trade, of even death. So I focused a lot on like life in the Anexo, but I also focused on the women who saw them as necessary resources for themselves. And even though they knew my kid is being abused, they're not eating enough. When they've come out, they've lost 20 pounds, they don't sleep, all of these things. And yet they're better off there than not. And it was that kind of ethical wager that women had to make that really interested me. And I began to see Anexos less as criminal spaces and more as kind of asylums for people that are most at risk during, with being in places where there's an intensification of criminal violence. And so these places have proliferated, all over. I worked a number of them in Ecatepec that were specifically for women. And of course, Ecatepec, there's a femicide. And so I began to sort of try to trace like the emergence of these Anexos for women, and how they were places really of refuge, but also of these bizarre treatment practices that are very questionable.
It is absolutely incredible story. It's amazing we hasn't been more done on this. There was one video which went viral actually just very recently, last week or so, had this guy kind of going in Noxo, and which is like a 7-Eleven in Mexico, and then suddenly he was like surrounded by people and grabbed and taken off to the Anexo. How come it's legal? How come they don't just raid these places and just like say, if people are against their will there, how come they just say like, we're going to free you? The police don't just break it open and say you're free to go.
There have been a few of those instances, but most people are paying bribes to the sanitation department, which is in charge of regulating addiction treatment programs. So they'll pay a bribe and they'll stay open. And so there's basically, also Anexos are a part of that system where they have to pay to play, basically. And so they don't close down. There have been a few high-profile massacres. And those, so, when Calderon was president, he would point to them and say, oh, these are all, narcos, they're gang members, that they're hiding out there, and Anexos are all hideouts for gangs. That is simply not the case. I'm sure there are people in there who are in gangs, but they're so much more complex.
Sorry, just about those massacres, because some of those were like in Chihuahua City and places. Do you know, I never understood exactly why those happened or what the motivation was. Did you understand like what motivated those massacres?
I mean, it's said that it was rival gangs, but it could also have been, there's speculation that it could have been, there are some cartels that refuse members of using the drugs that they're supposed to sell. And so it was a message. That's another theory. But ultimately, there was no investigation. And there were these 3 high-profile massacres. And nothing that I know of since. But these are such marginalized places that it wouldn't surprise me if there were other very severe acts of violence on them, but those just never make it to the news. It's because these were like big massacres that they made it to the news. And that gave me pause, because I was like just starting my study and people were like, you're crazy, you can't do this. But I fell into a community in Mexico City where the Anexos, they did really troubling things, but it was very clear to me that they did have an emphasis on helping people. Even if helping people means simply housing them and feeding them, it's somebody is keeping them inside, and it's usually a mother. And that mother usually understands what she's doing is keeping her kid away from the danger of the drug war.
What are the kind of methods they use, or the abuses that they do? I mean, are those combined? I mean, the methods themselves abusive, or is the abuse more like things like sexual assault or beatings, or like, how does it combine? So what are they? And is there any success? I mean, are they managed to free anybody from the problems of addiction?
The methods are really disturbing at times. There's a lot of physical and psychological abuse. There are beatings. There are at times chaining people to the wall if they're misbehaving. There's a lot of discipline. There's a lot of things that I felt had a very Catholic sensibility. These are Catholic spaces. There's always, some level of kind of a Catholic religious service every week. And so there were things like having to kneel on bottle caps and holding your arms outstretched for 5 hours. And if your arms begin to fall, you get smacked. And so a lot of stuff on bodily discipline. But then if you don't follow the rules, then you're gonna get hit. Or I always worried about the question of sexual abuse. Most of the Anexos I was studying, they were primarily young men, but there were always a few women. And I worried about what would happen at night when I would leave, because I would work, sometimes from morning till evening, but then I would go home to my own kids. And I was terribly concerned about what happened to these women. And I would always try the next day to glean from them if they were okay, what had happened, not without specifically asking. And I never asked about drugs. People would either talk to me about drugs or they wouldn't. But women did not, they talked about harassment a lot, being harassed by men, and I certainly saw it. But there weren't stories of sexual abuse in the Anexo, but there were tremendous stories of sexual abuse outside of the Anexo, including from men talking about being abused by their stepfather, by their, people that they were working with, so there was a lot of sexual abuse outside that I'm sure was a factor in getting these kids to begin to use drugs.
And the drugs, what drugs were they mainly using? And like you say, like some of them didn't consider themselves really addicts, but some of them were, and how bad?
Initially moving up from solvents, a lot of alcohol, some crack. If they could ever get it, it was wonderful to find cocaine, but that was very unusual. There was some heroin, there was some meth, and it really depended on where I was. And certainly in the north, it was mostly meth. But it was a diverse set of drugs, and because I didn't really ask about drugs specifically, it emerged as an issue, kind of organically. I wasn't really particularly interested in what are you using. I was more interested in why are you here? How did you get here? Because drugs is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And for me, the story was Mexico is increasingly violent, particularly for some people from certain communities. It's increasingly insecure. This is one institution that exists, that has proliferated, that people see as an option for keeping people safe. And that is not the story that is told in the newspaper. The few occasions when there is something in the Mexican news, it's like, this really high profile scene of police busting down an Anexo and pulling women out that they call slaves, and saying that all of the people are forced to work for Liverpool or some, company in Mexico, and they don't get paid. So they're like these prisons. I'm sure some of that first forced work, I've seen it, but they weren't prisons in the sense of a prison, but they were coercive, and people couldn't leave until their family either stopped paying or they were deemed, healed. And that could mean a lot of different things. But to answer one of your questions, a lot of people who were quote unquote healed went on to open up their own anexo. So once you become an anexado, you become a counselor, you become a padrino, and then you move on to open up your own. So it's kind of it's not a pyramid scheme, but it's one way that people make a living. So it's also an important economic force as well.
This is so fascinating. I could talk a lot more on this. Just very quickly, we've got about 4 minutes left. So I know you said you weren't sure of solutions when we're talking about New Mexico and drug addiction, but I'm still going to ask you anyway, because I don't know, but like, what are ways of reducing, talking about the US now on that side, reducing overdose deaths, reducing drug addiction? I mean, it was only a couple of minutes, but just a few pointers. What do you think are the ways we can try and look at this to try and make some advance in this issue?
Yeah, well, I live in San Francisco, and we're here experimenting with, various forms of needle exchange, safe injection sites, although that's been repealed. I think we need to recognize drugs as a fact, and we need to recognize that users can use more safely, possibly on the road to recovery. But I think our notion of recovery as abstinence has to change. I think people need to be able to incorporate drugs, if they are addicted, in their lives in a safer way. And I believe that we have the responsibility to provide that public health service. And so that's one of the things that I, am firmly for. And I think that there has to be simply more opportunities for young people. There needs to be schools, there needs to be jobs, there needs to be a sense of purpose and future. And in the Espanola Valley where I worked, that doesn't exist. And in Mexico City where I worked, that doesn't exist unless people are like, you know what, I'm going to have my own Anexo too. When I get out of here, I'm going to open up my own, and that's going to be my way of life. And that happens. I saw that happen. So, but I think that we need to destigmatize drug use first and foremost, and just, create spaces for drug users that are safe and understanding, and also just, have much better social welfare programs, which the US does not have.
So when you say space for drug use, when you have something like fentanyl, which is so lethal, would that mean trying to substitute it for a different opioid that's less lethal?
Exactly. Something that's less lethal. And that can be really hard because fentanyl, I've been to a few places not far from where I live where fentanyl is, used very visibly, very openly, injected with heroin. And how to get those people into treatment, because that drug is just so powerful and damaging. It's hard to know, but I have some faith that with injection drug users, there are answers to at least creating safe sites for injection drug use, and hopefully within those spaces, resources for other kinds of services.
That was fantastic, Angela. I could really talk a lot more about these issues. That was just a little glimpse, but yeah. But anyway, everyone check out Angela's books, links below, particularly the new book, which is just out now, and check out her work. Great to see some academics getting into this issue. We do really need answers, especially this drug addiction demand issue on that side, on the US side, to try and alleviate the demand funding the cartels. But anyway, great to have another episode of Crash Out, and outro boom.